What's a Thursday night without another edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast? We continue our positional reviews as we stick with the offense and look at the tight end position, because I heard the tight ends are really tight if you ask me. Welcome into another Strictly Stripes podcast off-season edition. Muhammad Ahmad here with Mike Neislick, who's back at it, as Andrew Gillis has the night off until Friday when we all reunite forces once again. And really just jumping into it, Mike, I mean, when you talk about tight end, there's only one place to start, and that's Hayden Hurst. And, you know, Hayden Hurst is always a positive conversation, especially when you think about just where his career was before he came to Cincinnati last year and where it's been. You know, just to kind of look at his stats real quick, like in his first 2 years with the Ravens in his career, he had 43 catches, over 500 yards, and 3 tutties. This year alone, he had 10 more catches than he did in those first 2 years, over 400 yards and 2 touchdowns. So, you know, obviously it was different in Baltimore. He was kind of behind Mark Andrews, and so he has more of a role now. He showed why, you know, Joe Burrow, you know, trusted him and why he was just so glad to be a part of an offense like that. And he said to me, and he said to others, he wants to be in Cincinnati. This is basically a place where he's like died and gone to heaven, which are his exact words. But it is a business. He was on a 1-year deal, so he's a free agent. His market value is about twice what he made this year, which he made about 3.5 last year. He's evaluated at about $6.8 million going into next year. And we've talked about trying to pay T. Higgins, trying to pay Joe Burrow, eventually trying to pay Jamar Chase. When you look at someone like Hayden Hurst, kind of 2 parts here for you, Mike. How much do you prioritize retaining him if that's the move? And if not, why do you think that might be difficult as far as like holding on to a guy like him?
Well, if he's looking for like a long-term deal, like above market value, above that, you know, like $6 million mark, I mean, the two sides probably don't have much to talk about, to be honest. You know, he's a little on the older side, you know, in terms of age. You know, he's not going to probably fit into their plans like in 3 to 4 years, but I think a short-term deal, another 1-year contract, and if he would give them, you know, I think $5 million sounds about reasonable where they could probably fit him in. You know, I think it makes sense for both sides. I think sometimes things don't need to be difficult, right? He's talked a lot and is a big mental health advocate. And, you know, he seems like he's found peace here and like he likes it here. And so sometimes that's more important than kind of making every single dollar. You know, the whole coaching staff is backed. He said how much he kind of has enjoyed the communication aspect that he didn't have at previous stops, that they're using him like how he feels he should be used on third downs, on short yard situations, red zone. And so, you know, it just makes a lot of sense. I said today in the kind of the story I had about the free agency question at this position, like not everything has to be complicated. I think it'd be a different story if, you know, they were looking to go younger and upgrade or spend more money. You know, there's some good free agents out there that you know, you could spend at the position and get somebody, you know, that might be a little bit of an upgrade, but that's not what they're in really the position to do. I think it makes more sense to try to develop a tight end out of the draft over the next year or two and use Hayden as kind of the bridge. I just think that his versatility, his being able to split out wide, you know, his numbers percentage-wise were up there with some of the top tight ends in terms of, you know, like 50% of the time he was not lining up on the line, you know, in a traditional tight end role. He was split out, you know, in the slot, and those are what the Bengals prioritize with the other receivers. You know, they want to create mismatches, and he's sort of the perfect fit. So, you know, like I said, I think it makes sense that they at least continue on together for another year or two, especially if you can keep that cap hit number down. Because like I said, they're not looking to spend a lot more money, but I think it's a case where I think both sides would kind of, you know, the Bengals would be maybe willing to spend a little bit more for Hurst, and Hurst would be willing to take less here because of how good of a situation it is.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, but to kind of bounce off what you just said about the cap space, I mean, you wrote this and, you know, the numbers are there. I mean, what they spent in tight ends last year for him, Drew Sample, Mitchell Wilcox, who we'll talk about later in the show. I mean, that was about just under 3.5% of their salary cap, which is dead center, you know, the league average as far as like percentage of salary cap going towards that position. And I, you know, like you said, and I agree, like that's probably where they want to be in 2023, especially when you realize like you don't want to have as much wiggle room beyond that because of what you want to try to do with Joe Burrow and what you ideally want to do with T. Higgins and the other free agents. I think they should try to keep like Von Bell, who we'll talk about with our position reviews on the defense later. But, there's an interesting point I really want to kind of get your thoughts on. He's talked so much about, how he's at peace here. And, his mental health story is, I think for anyone who hasn't seen or read or heard about it, they should absolutely do that because his story is so remarkable with what he's done with his foundation, how he uses his platform to advocate for, speaking up about depression and mental health. Like, he really is genuinely happier here. You can see that, and I think his teammates really see that. Even though, we don't know if he's looking for more of just kind of a quick short-term deal or a long-term deal, I think just from the perspective of being happy, being with someone like Joe Burrow, do you think he's maybe willing to say, hey, like, I know I'm worth this much, I'm worth that 6-7 mil a year type tight end salary, but because I'm so happy here and I may not get this anywhere else, even if other places give him the money, he might not have that peace of mind. Do you think like he might kind of compromise? Like, do you think players might look at that and say, money's great, but peace of mind is more important?
Well, yeah, because I think when you look at it, I mean, the cons of the money, right? Like, you can't get the maximum value here. But are you going to find a better situation anywhere else where you have a coaching staff you know and love? You have an offensive skill players that you're not going to be playing with anybody better if you go somewhere else. And you're not going to find a better quarterback probably. I mean, there's only one or two teams in the league with that kind of situation. So, what else could he be looking for? I mean, if he's looking strictly for money, then you'd think that, maybe this wouldn't be the best fit, but it seems like he's at a point in his career. I think he's made career earnings short of $15 million. I think one thing the Bengals could do is which they did this past year, make more of it guaranteed, do a bigger signing bonus. So he has less to lose in terms of if there is an injury, kind of meet him halfway with some of that stuff to be able to say, you put some skin in the game and we will too. So I think that'd be a way to sort of bridge that gap. If the numbers are completely crazy or off, yeah, it wouldn't work. But I just feel like it's such an attractive situation for a tight end like him that, I think as you saw in the postseason, he got better. They found he was one of the best tight ends in terms of production in the postseason. In the 3 games he played, those were his first 2 postseason victories as well. So I think there's a lot to be said to sort of finding a home. And it kind of stinks that maybe 3-4 years down the line you can't kind of project that. But for now, in the middle of Joe Burrow's prime, Jamar Chase's prime, there's probably nowhere else you'd want to be if you're a guy that is an offensive weapon like him.
And I mean, you think about it, like, he's not old, he's very young. I mean, I think he's only set to turn 27, 28 this year. Like, he's still pretty young, especially, for someone at his position. So on the one hand, he's
actually a little older. He's a little older. He's 29 and he's going to be 30 in August. So, because he got a little later start in his career because obviously it was in baseball before this. So that's why I think a short-term deal makes sense. He's not going to get much more than 3 or 4 years on the open market anyway, just because of that age. So I think you can, it's not too much of a difference. I think if you gave him more guaranteed money, like I said, I think that might help to sort of lock him in, at least just, like I said, for a year. Brandon Allen did a series of 1-year deals with the teams. With those veterans, I think it makes sense when you find a situation you're uncomfortable in to try to stick with it and, get something approximating, a healthy salary, which I think it is, and try to move forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that correction on his age because, I saw he's born in 93, so he will be 30 in, just over 6 months. So you're actually right. Like, he's a little bit on the older side just in general, especially at a tight end position where, like, I was talking with Andrew about this. I think you were on the pod. Like, Tony Gonzalez, like, guys like that, Antonio Gates, like, once they got to 35, 36, 37, they kind of leveled off. So he knows he's sort of on like the later end of his prime. I think he's still in it, but he's kind of leveling off. So I think he knows, like you just said it, the money can be somewhere else. But as far as like, long-term deals, long-term years, he may not get that. So I think if you're Hayden Hurst, you look at it as, look, I'm not getting any younger. I've made pretty good money. You talked about the signing bonus, paying him pretty well in the first half of his career. Peace of mind is important. And again, with his, mental health background, I think he values that more than anything. So I actually think that combining that with just, having Joe Burrow as your quarterback, it works out. And I think kind of the bigger thing here is like from an offensive standpoint, at least, and Ted Karras has kind of talked about this, like, yeah, maybe given the fact that the Bengals aren't the biggest market, they're not the richest team, even though they have a good salary cap situation. Most of the time, you're not always going to come and get rich. I mean, you can get paid pretty well. Like Ted Karras, I think, is on a $14 million deal for what he signed. But there's something to be said about, coming to a team to get paid versus coming to a team to win. I think these guys know, even if they're not getting that max deal, they're not getting that like money on the table, that they're leaving somewhere else, you're still going to be able to win a championship. You're going to be in a locker room with no egos, because like someone like Joe Burrow, and I'm actually, sneak peek for those who don't know, I'm doing something on why Joe Burrow, psychologically is such an effective leader. There's something to be said about that. Like the Joe Burrow effect is not like a cliche thing. It's a real thing. And the culture they've built is a real thing, as cliche as that word is. Like me and Marissa Contepelli talked about that. And so I think from the optimistic point of view, that's where it could work out for Hayden Hurst. But let's say the business side kind of takes over and Hurst decides, I love Cincinnati. I love my time here, but I think I can maybe chase something somewhere else. If the Bengals were to pursue something in free agency, at least for him, and we can talk more about draft prospects later, but as far as like, when it comes to free agency, who do you think the Bengals could target if Hayden Hurst ends up walking away?
Well, it's hard just because I think the draft is probably the more likely option at the position, just because I don't think they're going to be able to get involved in a guy that's going to make, upwards of $10 million. Evan Ingram's a free agent, and he'd be great, for a Joe Burrow-led offense. But that's just not a contract. He's going to want more years than they probably want to willing to give. And I just don't see them sort of being able to sort of handle that when they're going to have to pay a lot of money out for a lot of other guys. One name I mentioned in my story today was Foster Moreau, former teammate of Joe Burrow's. Like that's an option where he's younger than I think both those guys I mentioned. He's I think 26, going to be 26. Former fourth round pick out of LSU, had his best season with the Raiders. Is that a guy? What's the price tag there? Obviously that familiarity with Joe Burrow would make him just a great fit, and Jamar Chase in this offense. But, like I said, I think they're limited budget-wise. And so when you kind of take in those factors, I think the draft is sort of, the most likely option. I don't think you're going to be able to get a cheaper version of Hayden Hurst on the market. And so I think Hayden Hurst just sort of makes the most sense, as is. They won't have a lot coming back right now because obviously they got the other, you were mentioning Mitchell Wilcox, Andrew Sample. So it's not like they have somebody on the roster that's the heir apparent either.
And that's the thing too, like you said, I mean, he is the best option. And I'm glad you mentioned, Drew Sample and Mitch Wilcox, because, they provided something, and this is not a knock on Hayden Hurst, by the way. I'm just saying where this is not a big deal if for whatever reason you don't keep Hurst. I mean, from a blocking point of view, they don't really rely on tight ends. They rely more on like a jumbo set tight end / tackle. So in this case, like Hakeem Adeniji. And then when he filled in for Lyle Collins, it was Max Sharping. When he filled in for Alex Kappa, then they go to Jackson Carman and so on and so forth, Deontay Smith. So when it comes to blocking, I mean, they've relied more on, kind of that jumbo tackle, being a tight end / eligible receiver. And I mean, not that he's not capable of being a good pass blocker, but he wasn't really using those situations. As much as the Bengals have drafted tight ends early historically, like in the last 10 years, they haven't, when I say they haven't been used as much as like other players, I'm not saying they're not used in general. They're just not used in the way that like, you'd see most tight ends who block on other teams. They're used more in a receiving sense, but like even if you get someone who's not a Hayden Hurst, I think that's okay because you got Jamar Chase. You'll have T. Higgins. Like you still have Tyler Boyd for now, at least, assuming the Bengals don't try to go a cap casualty on him, like as, Andrew and I talked about. But it's not the worst thing in the world if you lose Hayden Hurst, but it is also one of the best things you could do if you keep him. So there's really no significant loss for the Bengals, no matter what happens here. But when we come back, we're going to talk about the other tight ends that we talked about. That's Drew Sample, Mitch Wilcox, Devin Asiasi. And we're going to get a little more in-depth about some draft prospects who could replace either of them or Hurst if any of them leave in free agency, as you're listening to the Strictly Stripes podcast. Hey there, it's Muhammad Ahmad from the Strictly Stripes podcast. You might be wondering, what exactly is Cincinnati Football Insider? Well, it's a community of fans who want the inside scoop on the Bengals and a direct connection to the Strictly Stripes podcast and the reporters who cover the team, and that would be me, Andrew Gillis, and Mike Neislick. It works like this. Andrew, Mike, and I will text your phone a few times a day with breaking news, analysis, and our insights on the Bengals. It's the inside scoop on what we're hearing, and we'll give you the inside word before it even hits social media. Being an insider is the best way to participate with the podcast and get in on special events and Zoom calls with me, Mike, and Andrew. And the best part is you can text us directly. It's a great way to cut through the clutter of Facebook, Twitter, other social media, and avoid the trolls for just $4.99 a month. Still not sure? Well, just try it for 2 weeks, and if you don't like it, you can text the word STOP at any time, but you won't want to cancel once you join the community of hardcore Bengals fans. Here's the best way to get on board. Go to cleveland.com/Bengals, click on the blue banner at the top of the page, or if it's easier, text 513-940-4193. It's a great time to try the 2 weeks free, as we'll be reporting live from the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. Plus, we'll be covering free agency on the way to the NFL Draft in April. Give us a try for 2 weeks and see what you think. Just text this number again. It's 513-940-4193 and become an insider today. And thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast as we continue talking about tight ends and what the future looks like at tight ends for the Bengals. So we talked a whole lot about Hayden Hurst, of course, Mike, because he's the center and the heart of that position for the Bengals. But I think there's something to be said about Mitchell Wilcox and Drew Sample, because just like Hayden Hurst, they're both set to be free agents. Sample's been with the Bengals since 2019. Wilcox came the year after him. Sample is actually one of Zach Taylor's favorites, as he said himself. He was only the second ever draft pick in the Zach Taylor era. Wilcox was an undrafted free agent who worked his way from the practice squad to the 53-man roster. That was a really cool story for him, and it took him a while to get there because he's been on the team 3 years now. You have Devin Asiasi as well, who played really an amount of snaps you can count on your hand. He only had 2 catches. Should have had a touchdown against the Dolphins. That wasn't a touchdown, but he's entering the final year of his deal, so I think they'll just keep him as kind of a comfortable third-string backup. But I think with Wilcox, there's something to be said about why I think it's important for the Bengals to retain him, because, you might look at him and say, oh, he was just, undrafted. He only, didn't really play much until this year. But think about it. He went from being on the 53-man roster to being the backup long snapper. I don't know. Is there a backup long snapper? I'd like to know. Backup long snapper, though, after Clark Harris went down in week 1, and then Drew Sample goes on a essentially season-ending IR to where he's the backup behind Hurst. Then Hurst misses 3 games in December with a calf injury, and he's starting, and he scores a touchdown, in Tampa Bay. He made a catch in the playoff game in Kansas City. He also made a catch against the Chiefs in the regular season. So he really elevated himself. And I think, just to kind of start with Wilcox, is he kind of a guy that maybe might be under the radar as far as like kind of what he's done, just being an undrafted free agent 3 years ago to doing what he did now? Like, do you think there's a significant role for him to be had next year?
Well, I think he was in a situation where, they grabbed Devin off waivers right after New England cut him right before the year. And is he a guy that replaces, Wilcox on the roster in season if he can kind of hit the ground running and hit a stride? But Wilcox sort of elevated his play. Obviously he kind of had an embarrassing first game for himself. Didn't really, obviously got thrown the spotlight on special teams, kind of handled that as well as you could. Admitted, he'd made a mistake on one of those snaps. Bounces back and, had to start 3 games for Hayden Hurst. Played well, scored his first career touchdown in that Tampa Bay game. I think he's a good, that's right, a good option for depth. He's not going to be, I think, a guy you put in a competition for the starting job, but at that number 2 spot, should get some looks on free agency in terms of, guys, your team's looking for added depth at the position. Showed he can do blocking. Showed he's effective in the pass game. Not obviously a deep threat. Can't move his around him much on the line as a Hayden Hurst type or a pass catching type tight end. But has soft hands and is able to catch the ball. Really was effective in that role when they asked him. With the snaps he did get. So I think he's effective, and I think he held off Devin to the point where I thought he didn't show much and probably is at risk of not sticking on the team. Whereas Wilcox, I think, is a guy that you look at say you want coming back. I don't know what to make a sample, obviously, just because with the injury and what his timeline for return is. They didn't talk about him much after he got injured, so we'll see. But I would think they'd only keep one of the two if they were to bring somebody back.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I'm kind of torn about, what to make of Drew Sample because he showed really good promise his first 2 years, including Joe Burrow's rookie year, but then the Super Bowl run, he got hurt and then came back and actually started in the Super Bowl because CJ Uzomah was a little shaky after he got hurt the game before that against Kansas City. So he started in the Super Bowl. I think he had a catch. He was a blocker as well as he could be with how bad Joe Burrow got hit. But, he's shown promise. He was a second-round pick, and, Zach Taylor really likes him, which makes it tough. But like you said, he's been hurt a bunch, which this sounds kind of selfish to say for the Bengals, but because he's been hurt so much, I don't know that it really raises his value to where he's going to be able to ask for more money. I don't think his value went up or down. I think it's kind of neutral, and he didn't really make much his first couple years. So it's possible you keep him on a cheap deal. But at the same time, though, with the situation, with everything else we mentioned with the Joe Burrow contract extension era, it's going to be hard to keep him and Wilcox and Hurst. I think out of the three, it would be a miracle if they kept all three. I think the most realistic situation is one of them goes, whether it's Hurst or Wilcox or Sample, or maybe you lose two and it's the two backups to where maybe you keep Hurst and it's thumbs up and then the draft will focus more on replacing Sample, replacing Wilcox, or one of the two. I think that's what the Bengals would hope for, is that you can kind of keep Hurst at the top and then build behind him, versus having to build back up again, or I could be wrong, but, when you talk about building back up and, replacing either of those three or one of those three, this is a really, really good draft, for the tight end position. I think more favorably to the running back spot, like I talked about with Andrew and we'll talk about with our mock drafts later, but we've talked so much about Michael Mayer that I think you can't talk about him enough because, even beyond the fact that, he played at Covington Catholic High School and he's from Highland Heights, which is just across the river in Kentucky from Cincinnati. He's a Bengals fan himself. He's, vocalized that. He was the best tight end in college football last year. He led all tight ends in targets, catches, yards, touchdowns at his position in the FBS level at least. Let's assume there's a situation where, you lose one of those guys or two of those guys even, and one of them happens to be Hayden Hurst. Would you prioritize someone like Michael Mayer more if you end up losing Hayden Hurst, or if you lose anyone other than Hurst, do you maybe not focus so much on a Michael Mayer and maybe focus on a tight end in day 2 or day 3?
Well, so what do they got? They got the 29th pick, and the cap hit is projected to be around $2.3 million for a first rounder. And for their second round pick, that kind of goes down to about a $1.1 million. So, how much do you want to invest at the position? If you were to get Hayden Hurst for $5 million, and then you got a first-round draft pick, you're looking at probably $10 million at the position. That's probably a lot for what they want to do. But, if you believe a guy is special, like Mayer's kind of like a special talent, I don't think they'd probably be able to get him where they're at. I would think Mayer goes a little earlier, but, it'll be interesting to see. I think I like the flexibility of maybe going a little later because if you have Hurst, assuming they re-sign Hurst, tight end to me makes sense, 2 through 4 to try to get somebody that's a little more, maybe less polished, and developing over the next year or two while you have Hurst kind of as your primary tight end. Then you could invest your first round pick elsewhere because I think they do have some needs sort of above that if they bring Hurst back. If they don't bring back Hurst, then Mayer type makes sense. First round pick because you need a guy that's probably starting ready. And you can't really take a risk doing that in the 5th round. So, or you can, but you're flipping a coin. So, it's tough. I think I'm assuming they bring Hurst back and that they'll invest somewhere in the first 4 rounds on a tight end. But that could be wrong.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think, we both unanimously kind of agree on that. And where in those first 4 rounds after the first round, I don't know. It might be too soon to say, but, kind of a little anecdote on Mayer. This is kind of a funny story I told a friend the other day. So Michael Mayer won a state championship his senior year with Covington Catholic High School, and he won Mr. Football, which I think he was the first Mr. Football to come out of CovCath and one of the only few to come out of Northern Kentucky. When I used to work in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which was my last job doing TV before I started covering the Bengals, I went through some old clips of Bowling Green High School's football team, and they actually played Michael Mayer his senior year in the state semis. And I saw highlights of this kid, and he had like 2 touchdowns against Bowling Green, and he mossed one of them. And I was thinking to myself, the people who played against this kid, like in the state of Kentucky, probably knew this guy was going to be more than like a Notre Dame star. Like I think they knew he was NFL ready. Like he's just the whole package. I mean, he's been called Mini Gronk for a reason, and we talk about someone like Gronk who's changed the position the way he did. I mean, or I guess it's Baby Gronk, not Mini Gronk. I mean, they call him Baby Gronk, which what a fitting compliment for him. I mean, like I said, there's really nothing else to say about why he's the best tight end in the draft. But I think if, you look at the other rounds and you go, rounds 2 through 4, there's still some other rich talent. Like I said, we talked a lot about Luke Musgrave. He had a great showing in the Senior Bowl practice week. And, he might be overlooked by some because of the fears of his injury that he had his senior year where he only played 2 games. But, I mean, you take that away, you're talking about a 6'6", 250-pound animal who's like bigger than any of the tight ends the Bengals have now. He's got the speed of like, someone who's almost like a wide receiver in some ways, which for his size is really scary. I do think he could do a little bit better with staying after his feet after the catch. I think he goes down a little bit too easily, but he's got great hands. He's very fast and physical. I really like Darnell Washington from Georgia. He just won 2 national titles with Kirby Smart and Todd Monken, who's now, like we talked about, with the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, he in some ways resembles more of like Mayer, but he's not as Mayer as he should be. Like he's more Mayer light. He could stay on his feet a little better than Musgrave, although I don't know how much his speed compares to Musgrave, but he's very Mayer light to me. But here's a guy you shouldn't sleep on. I haven't mentioned this name. Dalton Kincaid out of Utah. He's basically the best guy not named Michael Mayer statistically because he had the most targets, catches, yards, and touchdowns among all tight ends last year in the FBS. Among tight ends who wasn't named Michael Mayer, because Mayer led in that category. He's like everything you could ask for from Mayer, but I just don't think he's as big. I don't know how much he compares as far as like kind of breaking tackles and yards after catch, but the numbers speak for itself. Are there any other names that I didn't mention or anybody from those names that sticks out to you as a potential target for the Bengals?
Well, those guys are probably the first or second rounders. I think Kincaid might not fit as well. He plays a lot in the slot. And, while they did use Hurst in the slot, it was more like 20% of the time. I think you're looking at 50% of the time with Kincaid. And that's probably a little more than they would feel comfortable using. I think maybe, and then, Washington's interesting. He's got sort of, he's 6'7", with 269, almost the size of an offensive lineman. Do you want a less athletic guy that's bigger like that could do more blocking? I think they retooled their offense a little bit with Hurst in mind. So do they want to go sort of in the opposite direction? Do they want more of what they had last season, where they have that versatility where you can play them any of those 3 receiver spots almost and in line? So, interesting names. I think Musgrave's an interesting talent. I've seen projections for him all over the place after the Senior Bowl. Some people have been talking like late first round, which seems crazy to me. Like that seems too high, but like that second round pick, like he'd be great, I think, as that second round pick. It'd be hard for him to last that long probably, but there'd probably be good value in any of those 3 guys you mentioned, getting them in the second round where the Bengals are picking. But it's just a matter of who fits the best. And I think there's some pluses and minuses with Washington and Kincaid, where I think Musgrave would probably be a more no-brainer fit.
Yeah, Washington would be interesting because, like I said, when the Bengals kind of do their jumbo set formations, they like to use tackles. But maybe to have someone who's like a tackle and a tight end might be ideal because then you can save your tackles elsewhere if the Bengals want to go that way. But again, it just depends on do they want to continue what they did with Hurst? Would they like to have another jumbo guy who is still more of a pass catcher, but is just like, kind of like a Hakeem Adeniji, but at tight end, or a Deontay Smith, who's a better project in this case? Because I think Washington's just naturally a better player. I don't know. It'll be something to watch. And like with Musgrave, if he has a good combine, he has a good pro day, he could trend higher and higher. Because like I said, if it wasn't for his injury, he'd be like neck and neck with Mayer, but the injury kind of put him back. to where Mayer is like the undisputed number one right now. But I want to kind of wrap up with some fun because we always got to have fun on this podcast. It's what it's all about. When I think of Hayden Hurst, the one word that comes to mind is hurdle. You talked about how physical he is, how just juiced up he is when he's on the field. And a Hurst hurdle is always nice to see. Is there like a hurdle that you saw this year, you were just like, oh my God, he's him. Like that is the best Hayden Hurst hurdle. That's a lot of alliteration. The best Hayden Hurst hurdle I've ever seen, or are they all just kind of the same to you?
Well, they're similar because obviously style-wise they are. I think the playoff one would probably be the most impactful moment he had of the season because he got that first down, if I'm remembering correctly. I wish they had, next-gen stats, measures, all sorts of crazy stuff. Like they got to start measuring the height of hurdles because I think that'd really probably be the determining factor, right? Like how high was their highest point? Because then it'd be easy to say which one was like the clear best. But in terms of impact, the playoff one. But he's not afraid. He was battling leg injuries like hip and hamstring kind of things all throughout the season. I think he had a calf deal at one point, but never sort of was afraid to leave his feet. One time it didn't work out. He kind of got dropped. But those guys that show the extra effort and willing to put their body in line earn respect in that locker room pretty quick. And you saw, CJ was really well liked on this team, and they got a tight end that fit just as well. It was I just think the fit, the chemistry wise, everything worked out for Hurst. And those hurdles, I think, were just sort of evidence of how much he cared about this team.
Speaking of CJ, did you actually know before the Super Bowl, he said that if the Bengals had won the Super Bowl, he would literally bathe in Skyline chili? Did you know he said that?
No, I did not. That's
he said this like, I would think it was part of like the Super Bowl media availability they had. What'd you say?
Would it be public or private?
I don't know. He didn't specify that, but he was like, he said that he talked to a Big Cat on Pardon My Take from the Barstool, podcast they do, and he said like, he told him if the Bengals had won the Super Bowl last year that he was gonna jump in a pool a bathtub. It was a bathtub of chili. So I don't know if Hayden Hurst would quite do that. I mean, they're both very emotional, vocal guys, but CJ Uzomah was very different. I will say that. Very fun to watch, very charismatic, but they got a lot of energy and passion from Hayden Hurst, and that's what matters. I'd say, hurdles for me. I mean, it didn't technically count because this game was canceled, but that Buffalo game, before the game was shut down, he had a really, really nice hurdle. I forget who was over as one of the Bills linebackers, but it's almost like I'd never seen him that exciting where he was just like shaking, flexing his muscles, like he had just won a gladiator fight. I was like, Hayden Hurst with the hurdle. But yes, let's start a petition. I think NFL Next Gen Stats needs to start measuring that because I think Hayden Hurst would, if he wouldn't be number one, he'd be up there in the top 5. I mean, he's got a vertical for someone his size and experience.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
I like that. It's a good suggestion. Mike, appreciate your time. Stay with us because tomorrow the gang will be all back together as we wrap up our offensive positional outlooks and reviews with the offensive line as we break down the exterior O-line, the interior O-line, and then we're going to pivot forward to next week, setting up the defensive reviews, talking more about the combine and our mock drafts, and much, much more. But once again, for myself and Mike Neislick, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. See you Friday.